Trying to plan your EPQ presentation? Need some tips? I'd stay around. Watch this video. Hello and welcome to another lockdown learning session with me, Paul Holland. This session is designed for sixth formers who are just reaching the end of their EPQ project. You've probably put all the hard work in now to your research, you've produced your essay, you're certainly into the last final drafts of your essay, but you still need to put together that final presentation. The presentation is really important, isn't it? In lots of ways, it's the culmination of your EPQ project. This is a culmination of your project, first and foremost, because this is the moment when you present for the first time, obviously, to an audience of people, your entire project, your journey, your discoveries, your research, your opinions, your conclusions. So in that respect, obviously, this is a culmination. This is the moment in which you bring everything together and you try to persuade people that not only was it interesting for you, which hopefully it was, but it's going to be really interesting for them to learn all about it. And so you condense your 8 months, 9 months of work into these 10 to 15 minutes. But it's also a culmination in a more practical, direct sense, and that is that your supervisor will be the one who is also marking your presentation. And your supervisor at this point sits and watches you when you do your final presentation and makes notes on how the presentation went, how it was performed, what materials were used, what kind of audience was involved, how you responded to the audience. Also, your supervisor at this point is writing down lots of notes about the way that you responded to the questions at the end. The questions that were asked, and they often like to see the variety of questions that the audience asked and how you responded. So let's take a look at how the whole thing fits together and how you want your presentation to develop and the kind of format that you need it to take. So here we are. This is the shape of a general presentation. We are looking at 10 to 15 minutes. Now the exam board doesn't, I don't think, formally stipulate the exact length of time, but obviously you don't want it to be too short, you don't want it to be too long. Generally 10 to 15 minutes is a really nice length, and that then is followed by questions, remember. So we'll come to those in a moment. Your initial presentation of 10 to 15 minutes generally involves some kind of visual aid. Now, that can be in any format at all. As you know from the EPQ, there is a huge amount of freedom. If you've produced an artifact, some kind of product, whether that's a physical thing or something online or whatever that might be, that could be part of your visual aid, if you like. That could be something that the audience gets to see. They might even look at it or hand it around if it's something physical. But it could be a prop. They suggest that they can be posters or a flip chart, which is in some ways quite old-fashioned, I guess, these days. Other things that can be used are handouts. If you wanted to give out handouts, if you're with a live audience, handouts again can be quite useful. People sort of have them on their knee and they can refer to them. What you don't want, again, is a huge amount of information on those handouts. Paragraph after paragraph of dense material, which means that the person is not listening to you, they're looking at the handout. A handout is useful really only if you think of it as a prop, a tool at a particular moment in your presentation when you want to say, could I get you please to just look at page 2 in your handouts, or look at the image on the second side of your handout, look at the image at the top of the page, and you'll see exactly what I'm trying to explain here in my talk. Again, it's a possibility that you might find this is an easier thing to do on a PowerPoint slideshow. Most people will choose some kind of PowerPoint slideshow, and in lots of ways this works to the benefit of the person presenting. It gives you something to, if you like, hang on to, for people to be distracted by, in the sense that they're not looking at you anymore, they're looking at something on a screen, and that's often quite reassuring, I think, for some people. However, although I use the word distract, they mustn't distract, they mustn't detract from the main thing in the presentation, and that is you and your content. That's what people have come here to hear and to listen to, and this is the main body of what you're trying to present. You're trying to get people to listen to your talk and to think about your subject and to understand why you've taken that subject on and how important it has become to you and why you followed that particular direction. And then obviously also what your opinions and your conclusions are that have come out of your research and your project. The slideshow is an incredibly useful way of bringing your audience into your conversation and engaging them with what you want them to think. For this reason, you need to think very carefully about your slideshow. So let me just put up a few suggestions to you, things for you to think about. For everybody doing an EPQ, the answer will be different, because the wonderful thing about the EPQ is obviously that there's a huge amount of freedom, as we've said before, and everybody's project can be tailored in a different way. So here's some things for you to think about. Do you want the PowerPoint to be there right from the beginning, with arresting images, with things that are provoking people into thinking about something right from the beginning before you've even started talking? So you put the thing up and people are looking at things and they are already provoked and stimulated into thinking about particular themes or ideas. If you've got a topic that is particularly visual, perhaps art-based, or maybe historical topics with famous images from the past, perhaps, you know, scenes that are particularly, I don't know, famous or violent or provocative in some way, maybe you begin with those and then you bring your own self into it. Once you've set the screen up, you then begin to talk and say, "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, my name is so-and-so, and as you can see from these images, this evening I would like to be concentrating on blah, blah, blah." That's a nice way to do it. Another way that people often begin their presentation is to have it up on the screen with the title. You do want your title there on the screen at some point. Not necessarily at the beginning, but it's a nice way to get people thinking of your subject from the outset, if that's the way that you'd like to do it. It's a more formal, perhaps a more straightforward, straight talking way of doing it, so that people know what they're going to get in the next 10 minutes, 10, 15 minutes. Don't change your title, by the way. Don't have a special, slightly funkier version of your title for the presentation. The presentation is based squarely on your project, and therefore the title should be the same. When it comes to the content of your slideshow, or whatever visuals you're using to help, you must think of them as purely supportive to your talk. The slideshow, the PowerPoint, the handouts, whatever they are a tool, if you like, a support for you in your particular presentation. As I've said before, they mustn't detract. So for goodness sake, don't use any fonts that are really distracting or difficult to read. Don't use too much of the cool PowerPoint transitions that they end up grating slightly. They're distracting. They end up not looking very clever. They look a little bit gimmicky. Also, PowerPoint often has different kinds of backgrounds that people often use, and they're quite corporate looking. You often see them in business presentations. If you've got a background that absolutely suits your subject, that's great, or a particular format. If not, use a blank screen and design it yourself. Think about your font, keep it simple, but not boring necessarily. It can be an interesting font. and your font can sometimes reflect your particular subject matter. If I'm doing something on the ancient world, the classical world, I might choose a rather classical Roman Latin looking font, but if I'm doing something about modern times and technology, I might choose a particular font that reflects that. Somebody doing something about the 1920s might use that very 1920s Bauhaus font. But again, perhaps not for the entire project. Perhaps the headlines or the titles for a particular page on your slideshow might have an interesting font, but the body of the text should be something very straight talking and readable and big enough for people to see. Don't be afraid to split up your slideshow into lots of shorter slides, if you like, with much less information on. Don't have any more, I would say, than 5 or 6 bullet points with very short points to make, which you can then work through. If anything, split it up into individual bullet points and talk about each of those. When you are on full screen, don't forget, it's very easy to get the next slide just by pressing the large space bar at the bottom of the keyboard. That makes it really easy. You don't have to fiddle around with looking for the next one. And by the way, on the subject of that, look, if I show you how it looks when you've got it on the screen and it's not full screen, you'll notice that there's way too many distractions for the person watching. They want to know, first of all, how many more slides are left, especially if they're getting a bit bored. They might be looking to check if there's much longer left of your presentation. That's always a bad sign, I'm afraid. But also they'll look at what are the tabs you've got open perhaps, or they'll be looking at what's coming next or what they might have missed on the previous one. And also at every stage that you're trying to find the next one down the left of the page, they're following your cursor. They're working with you on getting to the next slide rather than listening to your content. In terms of your content, please check for little details that, again, it comes down to being distracted. If you've got spelling mistakes, or you don't have capital letters, or the font suddenly changes halfway through something, perhaps you've cut and pasted something, those are all things that take 10 minutes to sort out. Sit down, go through it very rigorously, get a friend perhaps to look at it and to see if there's anything that just jars and doesn't look quite right. And also, if you've got images and pictures, place them in a position that looks natural and seems to be easy to follow. If you've got several pictures together, make sure that they align. There's a brilliant facility as you move pictures around in the Microsoft PowerPoint program. That means that it lines them up. If you hover close to the next picture, it will join them up together and show exactly where you need to be. And if you need to change the size slightly so that one is not quite as big as the other one, that helps as well. Putting things in the middle, or if you've chosen to put things on the right, to make sure that you've pushed them exactly to where you want them. But to be consistent, that's another thing to do. Sometimes images look really good going right to the edge of the screen. That's good. But again, don't do that once and then do the next few differently, and then the next one slightly differently again. Think about the whole slideshow and how the whole thing's going to look over the course of often 15 slides, perhaps. Now, I have just mentioned the number of slides involved, and of course this is another thing that can be completely variable according to the individual projects. So there have been, for example, some pupils that I've taught who have been very successful with their presentation and their whole project, and shown only 6 or 7 slides throughout the whole course of their presentation. This again can vary enormously. One that I'm thinking about began, I think, with the first slide showing just about 6 or 7 bullet points of the journey that they took to get to their final title. In other words, some of the subjects that they thought about to begin with and the way that they explored them, then the title itself, and then the last 5 or 6 slides might just have the headings and the subheadings of the presentation that they're giving. Some people have a lot more slides. Some people have gone up to 18 or so slides and they whisk through them, but they've thought about them very carefully and they've made sure that those 18 slides follow some kind of very strict order, some kind of structure, so that the person isn't being dazzled by a huge amount of information that's been bombarded at them. It's worth bearing in mind that one useful thing that you can do with slides is to make sure that not too much information appears all at once, but then you can make things appear within a slide. And that's very simply done in PowerPoint. You simply duplicate the slide that you want to add some information to. So you can just duplicate it here at the top, or you can press Control D, and then that will duplicate exactly the same slide that you've got here, and then to this one you can add another text box, or you can add an image, or an image with some information underneath it. And as you're talking, while you've got this first one up, which just gives you the bare outline of what you want people to be thinking about while you're talking, then you simply press the space bar and up comes the next information, and that's what people will suddenly notice while you're talking. That allows you to save some information so that not everything is on the screen at once. And in fact, you can actually, using this method, build up to a whole screen of really complex, interesting information with diagrams and arrows, but not have it all shown at once. You can build it up so that as you flick through one to the next, each bit appears just as you're talking. This has the benefit that you are keeping people's attention on exactly the thing that you're talking about when you want them to think it. That works really well. And you can do this in other ways with, for example, highlighting a particular part of a picture. Here's this thing that I'm talking about, but actually in a minute I want you to focus on this little area. Here it comes. And then you focus in and then you talk about that, or you have another close-up. And again, this is very simply done by adding simply a rectangle and making sure that it's a transparent rectangle, but with a nice clear color, maybe white, maybe yellow outline. And that works really well. And you can do that with rectangles or ellipses and arrows and all sorts of bits and pieces. And last but definitely not least is the content. In fact, although I'm talking about this right at the end of this video, in many ways this is the first thing that you'll be thinking about. Do you know exactly where you want this presentation to go? Hopefully, yes, you do know where you intend this project to end up and where you want your audience to reach by the end of the whole process. But it's very important that you do enter this planning stage with an outline of what you want to get across and how you want to do it. And for that reason, even if it's not writing out a whole script, you do need to have planned some kind of a structure. Your classic structure of thought, if you like, is in so many ways to either start with a generalization and then home in into something very specific, or vice versa, starting with a very specific anecdotal example of something and broadening it out into something much wider, into more generalizations. So those are the two directions that you can take for your basic essay structures. In some ways, for some people this works, and certainly for a presentation. So from general to particular, or from particular to general. You may also feel that you would like to tell your audience a little bit about how you got to your subject. I think this is really worthwhile, but it needs to last no longer than a couple of minutes. It really doesn't. Really, what we're thinking about here is, particularly if you are a person who will stand up in front of an audience and surprise them that you've chosen this subject, and particularly if it's something unexpected and people who know you think, well, gosh, how on earth did he or she come down on this particular subject? Why did they choose this? Well, actually, that's a nice way for you to spend just a minute or two explaining that this is why you chose the subject, this is the journey you went on, and after thinking about this particular topic or that particular topic and then exploring these subtopics. This is how I ended up looking at the subject, and this is why I've chosen this title. But again, this should not distract from the whole thing. So make sure that at least within a minute or 2 minutes you are into your topic, into your subject. You've got the title on the board so that people know that you've reached the main subject of your presentation and you are ready to go into that in much more detail. Within the body of your presentation, be very careful not to include material which just doesn't need to be there. Just irrelevant material. Don't get sidetracked into all sorts of other discussions about related or even unrelated things. People often end up becoming quite nervous, particularly when they first do one of these things and they feel that it's endearing or in some ways comforting to chat and digress. No, people have come here to listen to you talk about a subject in a very focused, even intense way. That doesn't mean to say that you need to be intense in the way that you present it. Passionate is great, enthusiastic is good as well. Don't be intense, but the content of your presentation and the content of what you're trying to get across to the people listening needs to be focused so that you're not digressing into any areas that are distracting and actually, quite frankly, not what people have come to listen to. And that includes those kind of conversational habits that actually just don't belong in a proper formal presentation. The kind of things where you chuckle about some irrelevant point, or you make a joke about how you don't really understand this anyway, or you've never been able to pronounce this word. And actually people are there to hear that you can pronounce this word. If you didn't know how it was pronounced or you don't understand that particular point, actually you've had 6 to 8 or 9 months to actually work it out and find out. You're the expert in the room. There are things that you can always say you don't completely understand or you've not completely got your head around, and you can make that into a subtle point about the complexity of the subject, or the fact that your particular topic did not want to or did not have the scope to explore that in massive detail. You can give a hint that this would, if you had the time, be the subject of another project which you would like to do in the future. But don't give the impression that you don't care about it and that you probably would never have wanted to look into it in the first place. If it's a little detail of some sort, then you should have had the time to check it up and make sure that you professionally refer to it in the middle of your presentation. So there you have it. That's the planning for your presentation, for your EPQ. I hope that's given you lots of tips and hopefully given you some confidence as to the way to approach this. Hopefully you are thinking a little bit more, well, almost professionally in terms of how to approach this particular part of your EPQ. The next video will be about the presentation itself, how you want to project yourself, project your persona, how best to give the impression of your passion, your interest, without going over the top, and definitely how to avoid those nerves and how to avoid those complicated situations where you find yourself in a bit of a spiral. And of course, the all-important question and answer session at the end is going to be something that should have been playing on your mind a little bit by now. You can prepare for some of those in advance, and we'll be talking about that in the next video. So if you enjoyed this and if it was useful, that's fantastic. If you'd like to subscribe, then that's the place to do it, please. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Goodbye, good luck.